Good afternoon, gentle listeners. It's Erin, your librarian storyteller for the day. Welcome back to Legend and Lore, where every week I'll be telling you a handful of myths, folk tales, and fairy tales that come from different cultures from all around the world, from Japan to South Africa, from Greece to Polynesia. This week I'll be regaling you with some stories from Western Africa, specifically the countries of Ghana, Nigeria, and Liberia. Now make sure you stick around because at some point I'll be giving you a keyword to enter into your summer reading account. If you participate and earn enough keywords, you might just win a fabulous prize. Now with that PSA out of the way, let's dive back into the world of Western Africa. Now, there are several stories coming from all sorts of different tribes and countries. These particular ones, though, I've selected because either they deal with themes of trickery, cleverness, animals, or morals. All very important themes in Western African culture. Now, the first one I decided would be one of the many stories of the trickster spider god Anansi, who is probably the most beloved and most famous or infamous, depending on your point of view, as well as the keeper of stories. Now, how did he come to be that? However, well, that's the story I'm going to be telling you. As I said, this story originates in Ghana and has spread out throughout most of Africa and even to the Caribbean. So that's the one we're going to be starting with today. The story is called, again, How the Spider Obtained the Sky God's Stories. Now, once there were absolutely no stories in the world. They were all the possession of Nyame, the sky god, who guarded them very carefully. Anansi, however, truly wished to possess them and approached Nyame, who was his father, and offered to buy them off of his noble father. Nyame was very reluctant to part with the stories, and he claimed that Anansi could not afford them. Anansi was insistent, however, and though Nyame laughed and said that many great kingdoms like Kokofu, Bekwai, and Azumangaya had all tried to buy the stories from him, and none of them could afford it. So how in the world was Anansi, who was very small, very poor, and fairly weak in comparison, would succeed when all the others failed? Again, though, Anansi would not be deterred and promised that he could afford him if Nyame would only name his price. Finally, Nyame agreed to sell them to Anansi, but only if he would give him what he requested, and decided to set a price so high it would be nearly impossible, if not impossible completely, for Anansi to pay. The price would be that Anansi had to capture 4 of the most dangerous creatures in the world, namely Onini the python, the Mamboro hornets, Ozebo the leopard, and the fairy Moesha. Now again, Anansi was not intimidated and promised to bring Nyame all 4 of these things, and even decided that he would bring his own mother, Yanisa, who is also known as Mother Earth, and add her to the bargain. Nyame being very confused, but deciding to humor his son, accepted the offer, and advised that Anansi should begin as soon as possible. So off Anansi went, our mischievous little spider, off to put his plans into motion. However, like any wise person, any wise man, he decided to consult his wife before he went off on whatever trickery he had planned. His wife also was also a very clever individual, and she agreed to help him with his schemes. And after conspiring together, they came up with a plan. First, they would go after Onini, the python. Also advised Anansi to cut a branch from a palm tree and gather some string creeper vines before they went. Anansi agreed to her request, and catching on to what she had planned, the two went off to the river where the python made his home. Outside of his home, Anansi and Aso started to argue. Pretend argue for those who might be concerned, with a constant of, it is, it is not, it is not, so that the python, who was very annoyed by this, came out and demanded what was all the fuss about. Anansi claimed that Aso had said that Onini's body was far longer than a branch of a full-grown palm tree, which Anansi said could not possibly be. Onini, deciding he would help prove Anansi along, possibly just to get some peace and quiet, agreed to stretch out to his full length alongside a palm branch to prove that Aso was indeed correct. As he stretched out his body, Anansi and Aso took the moment as he was stretched out and vulnerable, to tie Onini to the palm tree with the creeper vines that they had brought, tying him so tightly that there was no way that Onini could get away. And thus the first of the animals was captured and brought to the Nyame as an offering. Nyame was impressed, but he still said, "You still have far more to go, Anansi. Do not continue onwards." After they brought Onini to Nyame, they decided that they would go after the Momboro hornets, and again he conspired with Oso about how best to go about it. In the end, they came up with a plan, and Anansi brought with him a gourd filled with water. He brought the gourd to where the hornets made their home and sprinkled a bit onto their nest, making sure that he kept enough for himself. After he sprinkled on the hornet's nest, he poured the rest onto himself by way of a banana leaf that he had cut from a tree nearby, dousing his head completely with it. When the hornets exited their nest in a rage, ready to sting and show vengeance upon whatever had gotten them wet, Anansi showed them the banana leaf that was still wet and said that it had been raining. It was not to do with him. Anansi then warned the hornets that the rain could be completely deadly to them. They might very well drown. So he advised them, "Enter my gourd. You will be safe if you stay in here." The hornets agreed and thanked Anansi for helping them, completely unaware of the schemes that he was up to. And they all flew inside the gourd, which Anansi very quickly stoppered with a cork and brought back to Nyame, presenting the second of the creatures that Anansi had promised him. Nyame again was impressed, but he still said, Do not get a big head yet, Anansi. There are still more to go." Onwards came to the third creature, and after consulting with Oso again, they came up with a fairly simple but effective means of getting Ozubo the leopard into their grasp. Anansi dug a hole along Ozubo's root and covered it with brushwood, leaves, palm leaves, the whole 9 yards, and planned for when Ozubo came out at night to take on his normal route, he would fall in. As he suspected, come the morning when Anansi returned to the hole, there was Ozubo the leopard trapped at the bottom of it. Anansi pretended that he was very sad and very sorry for the poor leopard, that why in the world are you down there? Ozubo said he had no idea, as Anansi's words were so full of honey and so sweet that he could not discern the trickery behind them. He begged and pleaded, "Please help me out. Please get me out of here." Anansi hemmed and hawed, said, "I would be very grateful, but I am so nervous that you would hurt me and eat me if I did so." Ozubo promised, "I will not eat you. Please, please help me." So Anansi said, "Fine, but you must stick out your arms all the way through, so I know that you will not try to claw me." Ozubo consented to this and stuck out his arms, and now he was vulnerable. Using his webs, Anansi lowered them down so that Ozubo might be able to climb out. But as soon as Ozubo started climbing the web ladder that Anansi had created for him, Anansi then rapidly used his webs to again tie up Ozubo, and so tightly that he was not able to escape. And once again, the third creature was captured and brought to Nyame. Nyame was starting to get a little worried by this, but he was still certain the last capture would be absolutely impossible, and there was no way that Anansi would succeed in his challenge. Now, Anansi the spider had a very difficult task ahead of him. Moesha the fairy was a very tricky creature, and not so easily fooled as the rest of the animals. However, again, consulting with Oso, for a much longer time this way, I might add, they finally came up with a plan. To catch the fairy, Anansi created a small little doll and covered it with sticky gum from a tree. He placed the doll under the tree of life where the fairies would play and put some yam in a bowl in front of it. The fairy eventually made its way out of the tree, and Moesha was so happy to see a wonderful offering in front of that had been presented. Gobbling it up, she gratefully thanked the doll, which of course, being a doll, it could not reply. Very annoyed at its bad manners, the fairy reached out and struck the doll again and again, or at least She would have, if not with that first slap down onto the doll, her hand got stuck on the gum. First with one hand, then with another. With her hands completely trapped on the doll, Anansi captured her too, and brought her to Nyame. Anansi had brought almost all that he had promised, except for his mother. And Nyame was certain that, as he was the sky god, no way Mother Earth would be fooled by her own son's trickery. There was absolutely no way. It turns out he was right in the end, because Anansi did not try to trick Yanisa. Instead, he simply went to her and asked her, as the son to a mother, if she would please come with him and be presented to their mighty father. Yanisa, grateful that her son had not tried to trick him and had simply asked her permission, agreed to go with Anansi, and traveled up the way to where the sky god made his home. Completely bewildered, the sky god Nyame agreed that Anansi had indeed paid the price he had asked for. He acknowledged Anansi's talents and told the spider he now had the sky god's blessing. The people rejoiced, and he announced that his stories would no longer be by his name or belong to him, as from now on, the sky god's stories would belong to Anansi, and all of them would be known as the spider tales, or the spider stories, for all eternity. Anansi, being happy, spread out his stories across the world so that everyone might find joy in them. So it is that every story, no matter subject or theme, is indeed called a spider story. And that is one of the most infamous stories of Anansi. I thought he was rather clever, and many versions, take out the inclusion of Yanisa or Aso, but I thought it showed his absolute wisdom that he did not just rely on his own cunning, but also used the cunnings of his allies in order to get his means. We will now move on to a story from Nigeria. This one is mainly focused on animals. Animals play a large part in Western African culture, as the stories around them are meant to either symbolize how they became how they are today, or meant to symbolize certain human traits that might either be vilified or admired. This one in particular is a two-parter, and it is called Concerning the Leopard, the Squirrel, and the Tortoise. Many years ago, there was a great famine throughout the land, and all the people were starving. The yam crop had failed, the plantains did not bear any fruit, the groundnuts were all shriveled up, and the corn never came to a head. Even the palm oil nuts did not ripen, and the peppers and okros also gave out. The leopard, however, who lived entirely on beef, did not care for any of these things, and although some of the animals who lived on corn and the growing crops began to get rather skinny, he did not very much mind. In order to save himself trouble, as everybody was complaining of the famine, he called a meeting of all the animals and told them that, as they all knew, he was very powerful, and he must have food, and that since the famine did not affect him, as he only lived on flesh, and as there were plenty of other animals about, he had no intention of starving. He then told the animals present at the meeting that if they did not wish to be killed, that they must instead bring their grandmothers to him to offer as food, and when they were finished with that, they would then offer their mothers. The animals might bring their grandmothers in succession, and he would take them in turn, so that as there were many different animals, it would probably be some time before their mothers were eaten, by which time it was entirely possible that the famine was over. But in any case, he warned them that he was determined to have sufficient food for himself, and that if the grandmothers or mothers were not forthcoming, he would turn upon the young people themselves and kill and eat them. This, of course, the young generation who attended the meeting did not appreciate, but in order to save their own skin, they agreed to supply the leopard with his daily meal. The first to appear with his aged grandmother was the squirrel. The grandmother was a poor, decrepit old thing with a mangy tail, and the leopard swallowed her in one gulp and looked around for more. In an angry voice he growled out, "This is not proper food for me. I must have more at once." Then the bush cat pushed his old grandmother in front of the leopard, but he snarled at her and said, "Take this nasty old thing away. I want some sweet food." It was then the turn of the bush buck, and after a great deal of hesitation, a wretchedly poor and thin old doe tottered and fell in front of the leopard, who immediately dispatched her, and although the meal was very unsatisfactory, he declared that his appetite was appeased for that day. The next day, a few more animals brought their old grandmothers, until at last it became the tortoise's turn. But being very cunning, he produced witnesses to prove that his grandmother was dead, so the leopard excused him, and his grandmother was safe. After a few days, all the animals' grandmothers were exhausted, and it became the turn of the mothers to supply food for the ravenous leopard. Now, although most of the young animals did not mind getting rid of their grandmothers, whom they had scarcely ever known, many of them had very strong objections to providing their mothers, of whom they were very fond, as food for the leopard. Amongst the strongest objectors was the squirrel and the tortoise. The tortoise, who had thought the whole thing out, was aware, as everyone knew, that his mother was alive, she being a rather amiable person and friendly with all comers. The same excuse would not avail him a second time. He therefore told his mother to climb up a palm tree, and that he would provide her with food until the famine was over. He instructed her to let down a basket every day, and said that he would place food in it for her. The tortoise made the basket for his mother, and attached to it a long string of tie-tie. The string was so strong that she could haul her son up whenever he wished to visit. And all was well for a few days, as the tortoise used to go at daylight to the bottom of the tree where his mother lived, and place her food in the basket. Then the old lady would pull the basket up, have her food, and the tortoise would depart on his daily round in his usual leisurely manner. In the meantime, the leopard had to have his daily food, and the squirrel's turn came first after the grandmothers had been finished, so he was forced to produce his mother for the leopard to eat, as he was a poor, weak thing, and not possessed any cunning. The squirrel was, however, very fond of his mother, and when she had been eaten, he remembered that the tortoise had not produced his grandmother for the leopard's food. He then was determined to set a watch on the movements of the tortoise. The very next morning, while he was gathering nuts, he saw the tortoise walking very slowly towards the bush, and being high up in the trees and able to travel very fast, had no difficulty in keeping the tortoise in sight without being noticed. When the tortoise at last arrived at the foot of the tree where his mother lived, he placed the food into the basket where his mother had let down already by the tie-tie, and having got into the basket and was given a pull at the string to signify that everything was all right, was hauled up, and after a time was let down again in the basket. The squirrel was watching all the time, and directly after the tortoise had gone, jumped from branch to branch of the trees, and very quickly arrived at the place where the leopard was snoozing. When he woke up, the little squirrel said, "You have eaten my grandmother and my mother, but the tortoise has not provided any food for you. It is now his turn, and he has hidden his mother away in a tree." The leopard was very angry to hear this, and told the squirrel to lead him at once to the tree where the tortoise's mother lived. But as it was nighttime, the squirrel said, "The tortoise only goes at daylight when his mother lets down a basket, so if you go in the morning early, she will pull you up, and then you can kill her." To this the leopard agreed, and the next morning the squirrel came at cock's crow and led the leopard to the tree where the tortoise's mother was hidden. The old lady had already let down the basket for her daily supply of food, and the leopard got into it and gave the line a pull. But except for a few small jerks, nothing happened, as the old mother tortoise was not really strong enough to pull up a heavy leopard off the ground. When the leopard saw that he was not going to be pulled up, being an expert climber anyway, he scrambled up the tree, and when he got to the top, he found the poor old tortoise, whose shell was so tough and so rough that he thought she was not worth eating. So instead he threw her down to the ground in a violent temper, and then came down himself and went home. Shortly after this, the tortoise arrived at the tree, and finding the basket on the ground, gave his usual tug at it, but there was no answer. He then looked about, and after a little while came upon the broken shell of his poor old mother, who by this time was quite dead. The tortoise knew at once that the leopard had killed his mother, and made up his mind that for the future he would live alone and have nothing to do with the other animals. I know, a very tragic end, but it's not actually the end, because this one has a two-parter. Following this is the story of the leopard, the tortoise, and the bush rat. At the time of the Great Famine, all the animals were very thin and weak from want of food, but there was one exception, and that was the tortoise and all his family, who were all quite fat and did not seem to suffer at all. Even the leopard was growing very thin, in spite of the arrangement he had made with the other animals to bring them their old grandmothers and mothers for food. In the early days of the famine, as you will remember, the leopard had killed the mother of the tortoise in consequence, for which the tortoise was very angry at the leopard, and determined, if possible, to seek his revenge upon him. The tortoise, who was very clever, had discovered a shallow lake full of fish in the middle of the forest, and every morning he would go to the lake and without much trouble bring back enough food for himself and his family. One day, the leopard met the tortoise and noticed how fat he was. As he was very thin himself, he decided to watch the tortoise, so the next morning he hid himself in the long grass near the tortoise's house and waited very patiently, until at last the tortoise came along quite slowly, carrying a basket which appeared to be very heavy. Then the leopard sprang out and said to the tortoise, "What have you got in that basket?" The tortoise, as he did not want to lose his breakfast, replied that he was carrying firewood back to his home. Unfortunately for the tortoise, the leopard had a very acute sense of smell, and he knew at once that there was fish in the basket. So he said, "I know there is fish in there, and I am going to eat it." The tortoise was not really in a position to refuse, as he was such a poor creature, and said, "Very well, let us sit down under this shady tree, and if you will make a fire, I will go to my house and get pepper, oil, and salt, and then we will feed together." To this the leopard agreed, and began to search about for dry wood, and started the fire. In the meantime, the tortoise waddled off to his house, and very soon returned with the pepper, salt, and oil. He also brought along a long piece of cane tie-tie, if you remember from our first story, which is very strong. This he put on the ground and began boiling the fish. Then he said to the leopard, "While we are waiting for the fish to cook, let us play at tying one another to a tree. You may tie me up first, and when I say tighten, you must loosen the rope, and when I say loosen, you must tighten the rope." The leopard, who was very hungry and thought the game might make time pass more quickly until the fish was cooked, said he could play. The tortoise then stood with his back to the tree and said, "Loosen the rope," and the leopard, in accordance with the rules, began to tie up the tortoise. Afterwards, the tortoise shouted out, "Tighten!" and the leopard at once unfastened the tie-tie, and the tortoise was free. The tortoise then said, "Now, leopard, it is your turn." So the leopard stood up against the tree and called out to the tortoise to loosen the rope, and the tortoise at once, very quickly, passed the rope several times round the leopard and got him fast to the tree. Then the leopard said, "Tighten the rope," but instead of playing the game in accordance with the rules he had laid down, the tortoise ran faster and faster with the rope around the leopard, taking great care, however, to keep out of reach of the leopard's claws. And very soon had the leopard so securely fastened that it was quite impossible for him to free himself. All this time the leopard was calling out to the tortoise to let him go. He was tired of the game. But the tortoise only laughed, and he sat down to the fire to eat his meal. When he finished, he picked up the remainder of the fish for his family and prepared to go. But before he started, he said to the leopard, "You killed my mother, and now you want to take my fish. It is not likely that I am going to the lake to get fish for you, so I shall leave you here to starve." He then threw the remains of the pepper and salt into the leopard's eyes and quietly went on his way, leaving the leopard roaring with pain. All that day and throughout the night the leopard was calling out for someone to release him and vowing all sorts of vengeance on the tortoise. But no one came, as the people and animals of the forest do not like to hear the leopard's voice. In the morning, when the animals began to go about to get their food, the leopard called out to each and every one of them to come and untie him, but they all refused, as they knew that if they did so, the leopard would most likely kill them and eat them once he was free. Finally, a bush rat came near and saw the leopard tied up to the tree and asked him what was the matter. So the leopard told him that he had been playing a game of tight and loose with the tortoise, and that he had tied him up and left him there to starve. The leopard then implored the bush rat to cut the ropes with his sharp teeth. The bush rat was very sorry for the leopard, but at the same time he knew that if he let the leopard go, he would most likely be killed and eaten, so he hesitated and said that he did not quite see his way to cutting the ropes. But this bush rat, being rather kind-hearted and having had some experience of traps himself, could sympathize with the leopard in his uncomfortable position. Therefore, he thought for a time and came up with a plan. He first started to dig a hole under the tree, quite regardless of the leopard's cries. When he finished the hole, he came out and cut one of the ropes, and immediately ran into his hole, and waited there to see what would happen. And although the leopard struggled frantically, he still could not get loose, as the tortoise had tied him up very securely. After a time, when he saw that he was in no danger, the bush rat crept out again, and very carefully bit through another rope, and then retired to his hole as before. Again, nothing happened, and he began to feel more confident, so he bit through several strands, through one after the other, until at last the leopard was free. The leopard, who was ravenous with hunger, instead of being grateful to the bush rat, directly after he was free, made a dash at the bush rat with his big paw, but just missed him, as the bush rat had dived for his hole. However, the bush rat was not quite so quick to escape altogether, and the leopard's sharp claws scored his back and left marks which he carried to his grave. Ever since then, the bush rat has had white spots on their skins, which represent the marks of the leopard's claws. Well, that had an interesting ending, don't you think? Not exactly what you were expecting. Who got their comeuppance, do you think? Was the tortoise wrong? Was the leopard wrong? Was the bush rat a fool? Was the bush rat kind? It's entirely up to you. The rules of nature are not quite so black and white as the morals of society would tell us. So, whoever is in fault here, whoever's the hero, that's entirely up to you. Now, as I promised, I do have a keyword for you. In all caps, referring back to our first story, the keyword of the day, again, all caps, is nyame. the sky god. You would spell that Nyame, Nyame. Enter that into your Hopkinton Public Library summer reading account and enter in to win a fabulous prize. I have one more story that I'd like to tell you. The tale of the cow-tail switch, originating most likely from Liberia. Now, just so you have an idea, a cow-tail switch is something that is well known in most Africa and technically symbolizes authority. It's a very treasured piece of a cow. So just to give you an idea why all these people are fighting over such a prize. Near the edge of the Liberian rainforest, on a hill overlooking the Calvary River, was the small village of Kundi. Its rice and cassava fields spread in all directions. Cattle grazed in the grassland near the river. Smoke from the fires in the round clay houses seeped through the palm leaf roofs, and from a distance these faint columns of smoke seemed to hover over the village. Men and boys fished in the river with nets, and women and girls pounded grain in wooden mortars before the houses. In this village, with his wife and many children, lived a hunter by the name of Ogolosa. One morning, Ogolosa took his weapons down from the wall of his house and went into the forest to hunt. His wife and his children went to tend their fields and drove their cattle out to graze. The day passed and they ate their evening meal of manioc and fish. Darkness came, but Ogolosa did not return. Another day went by, and still Ogolosa did not come back. They talked about it and wondered what could have detained him. A week passed, then a month. Sometimes Ogolosa's sons mentioned that he hadn't come home. The family cared for the crops, and the sons hunted for game. But after a while, they no longer talked about Ogolosa's disappearance. Finally, one day, another son was born to Ogolosa's wife, who had been pregnant when Ogolosa had left. His name was Puli. Puli grew older, he began to talk, and the first thing he said was, "Where is my father?" The other sons looked across the rice fields. "Yes," one of them said. "Where is father?" "He should have returned long ago," another one said. "Something must have happened. We ought to look for him," a third son said. "He went into the forest, but where will we find him?" another one asked. "I saw him go," one of them said. "He went that way, across the river. Let us follow the trail and search for him." So the sons took their weapons and started out to search for Ogolosa. When they were deep among the great trees and vines of the forest, they lost the trail. They searched in the forest until one of them found the trail again. They followed it until they lost their way once more, and then another son found the trail. It was dark in the forest, and many times they became lost. Each time another son found the way. At last they came to a clearing among the trees, and there on the ground, scattered about, lay Ogolosa's bones and his rusted weapons. They knew then that Ogolosa had been killed in the hunt. One of the sons stepped forward and said, "I know how to put a dead person's bones together." He gathered all of Ogolosa's bones and put them together, each in its own place. Another son said, "I have knowledge too. I know how to cover the skin with sinews and flesh." He went to work, and he covered Ogolosa's bones with sinews and flesh until he returned to his own appearance. A third son said, "I have the power to put blood into a body." He went forth and put blood into Ogolosa's veins, bringing color back to the man's cheeks, and then he stepped aside. Another son said, "I can put breath into a body." He did his work, and when he was through, they all saw Ogolosa's chest rising and falling. "I can give the power of movement to a body," another one said. He put the power of movement into his father's body, and Ogolosa sat up and opened his eyes. Finally, another son said, "I can give him the power of speech." He gave the body the power of speech, and then he stepped back. Ogolosa looked around him. He stood up, and he opened his mouth, and he asked, "Where are my weapons?" They picked up his rusted weapons from the grass where they lay and gave them to him. Then they returned the way they had came, through the forest and the rice fields, until they at last arrived back at the village. Ogolosa went into his house. His wife had prepared a bath for him, and he bathed. She prepared food for him, and he ate. 4 days he remained in the house, and on the 5th day he came out and shaved his head, because this is what people did when they came back from the land of the dead. Afterwards he killed a cow for a great feast. He took the cow's tail and braided it. He decorated it with beads and cowrie shells and bits of shiny metal. It was a beautiful thing. Ogolosa carried it with him to important affairs. When there was a dance or an important ceremony, he always had it with him. The people of the village thought it was the most beautiful cow-tail switch they had ever seen. Soon there was a celebration in the village because Ogolosa had returned from the dead. The people dressed in their best clothes, the musicians brought out their instruments, and a big dance began. The drummers beat their drums and the women sang. The people drank much palm wine. Everyone was happy. Okaloosa carried his cowtail switch and everyone admired it. Some of the men grew bold and came forward to Okaloosa and asked for the cowtail switch, but Okaloosa kept it in his hand. Now and then there was a clamor and much confusion, as many people asked for it at once. The women and children begged for it too, but Okaloosa refused them all. Finally, he stood up to talk. The dancing stopped and the people came close to hear what Okaloosa had to say. "A long time ago I went into the forest. While I was hunting, I was killed by a leopard. Then my sons came for me. They brought me back from the dead, but I have only one cowtail switch to give. I shall give it to the one who did the most to bring me home." As a result, an argument started. "He will give it to me," one of the sons said. "It was I who did the most, for I found the trail in the forest where it was lost." "No, he will give it to me," another son said. "It was I who put his bones together." "It was I who covered his bones with sinews and flesh," another said. "He will give it to me." "It was I who gave him the power of movement," another son said. "I deserve it most." Another said it was he who should have the switch, because he had put blood into Okaloosa's veins. And yet another claimed that because he had put breath in the body. Each of the sons argued his right to possess the wonderful cowtail switch. Before long, not only the sons, but the other people of the village were talking. Some of them argued that the son who put blood in Okaloosa's veins should get the switch. Others that the one who had given Okaloosa breath should get it. Some of them believed that all the sons had done equal things, and that they should share it. Everyone argued back and forth, this way and that, until Okaloosa finally asked them all to be quiet. "To this son I will give the cowtail switch, for I owe him the most," Okaloosa said. He came forward, bent low, and handed it to Puli, the little boy who had been born while Okaloosa was in the forest. The people of the village were outraged and angry, and the rest of the sons, "What has he done to deserve it?" Until they remembered. The child's first words had been, "Where is my father?" And they knew that Okaloosa was right. For it is a saying among them that a man is not really dead until he is forgotten. And that is all I have for you today, gentle listeners. Tune in next time for another peek into the mythology and the folk tales of another culture from around the world. I hope to see you all very soon. Be well and have a wonderful rest of the day. Bye.